Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest edition of Crapper with my good friend Shaun Hall.
Yeah.
And myself, Peter Turner. We have broken free of the chains of Tim and his world of rock, and we are going to talk about something very different today, which is jazz. And we thought we'd give it a chance because obviously it's not something we discuss on the channel at all. But we thought we'd give you a sort of potted history of 20th century jazz, because obviously now we are in the 21st century and things are moving on. So we thought we'd do a two-parter. About the development of jazz in the USA, essentially. This hopefully serves as a sort of introduction to, jazz for rock fans, people maybe who are intrigued by it, not sure what all the fuss is about, not sure how to get into it, haven't dabbled much. We're going to discuss our favorite instrumental jazz tracks and also, our vocal tracks from the 20s right through to the 1970s. We'll talk about the sort of basic outline of history of jazz through the decades and the way that styles have changed, obviously, and the reasons why we both got into jazz and why we still listen to it today and still, sort of enjoying the different feel we get from jazz as we do to rock music, of course. So today we're going to cover the period 1920 right up to the late 40s and 1949. So I suppose for two rock people, two people who went through the 80s, been through all the pop stuff, and the kind of, have sort of gone back and listened to things like prog rock and things that weren't in our time. There may be the question as to why we would have got into jazz at all, really. I mean, Shaun, do you want to tell us how it all happened for you?
Yeah, well, I guess in my family it was fairly music listeners, not exactly players, but my brother Steve, I've often talked about on the main feed. He was into stuff like Genesis and some of the prog rock and classic rock stuff, and my father was very much into traditional jazz, so going right the way back to sort of 1920s stuff, Kid Ory, that sort of stuff, Louis Armstrong, going into sort of big band, and ending round about the period where Dave Brubeck starts. So I was a little bit bemused by jazz. I thought it was very old sounding growing up, and until probably my father, I developed an interest in drumming, obviously, in my early teens, having heard all this sort of prog rock stuff. And you start to get jazz drummers name checked by some of these classic rock performers, and so I sort of asked my father, and he sort of pulled out some albums, and there was stuff with Gene Krupa on, Buddy Rich, obviously, and Dave Brubeck as well. There was Joe Morello, who I really rate highly. He's like a sort of more a percussionist. So that sort of went in, and suddenly an alarm bell sounded, and I started to have my sort of way into jazz, my route into jazz through drummers, really. And then growing up at secondary school, I got into a sort of a school jazz band, which carried on into my 20s, a sort of swing band. And then in later life, I played with a friend who was a jazz guitarist, liked sort of Kenny Burrell and Wes Montgomery, that sort of stuff, sort of cool jazz. So so that's where it began.
Yeah. And so you have a sort of family identity with jazz, and it seems that everything up to that sort of point of like cool jazz and sort of 50s, that's where it kind of ended for you there. But I guess you've sort of moved on and explored other things since. So my first sort of introduction to jazz was actually through this random record I picked up. It was a great record shop where I used to live on the Isle of Wight. Guy in there has so much stock, and I used to just go through all this secondhand stuff, and I found something called Three Giants, and this was a radio broadcast from 1955, and it had in America, and it had Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, and Billie Holiday on it, all with the sort of house band, I assume probably Duke Ellington's band, and so Billie Holiday really interested me. I think mainly because I'd never liked Louis Armstrong's voice. I'm not sure He's known as a singer, isn't he? But really, he's a trumpet player. But I really got into sort of Billie Holiday's voice, and then I thought, oh, this is jazz singing. And then I suddenly ran into Ella Fitzgerald, looking at sort of jazz singers of the time, and realised, there are different singers to Billie Holiday. More on that later. And I entered this sort of world of jazz song, and I haven't really listened to instrumental stuff. It was just song at that point. And then I realised, actually, listening to Oscar Peterson, who's a very popular kind of cocktail jazz sort of player, although not all the time, but that's the sort of how he became popular. It was all songs, basically. They were playing songs, and people like Carmen McRae I got into, and Sarah Vaughan, people like Stan Getz, and then Sinatra. So people are sort of taking these songs and sort of making them into something interesting. That for me was the sort of basis of all my listening, and I think after a while you get a bit tired of that. You get a bit tired of the kind of the simplicity of that, although it's engaging it to a level. If you're not used to listening to things like that, I think after a while you want something a bit more challenging. I've always wanted just something that's going to push the boundaries a bit, something that's going to make me think more. And about 10 years ago or so, I started getting into people like John Coltrane from the 50s and 60s, and Miles Davis, Ornette Coleman, Bill Evans, and more recently sort of Keith Jarrett, actually, who's in a strange way a sort of traditionalist, really. My favourite form, though, that I like to listen to is the piano trio. Always really enjoy that, and it's something to do with the tightness of it and the space for all the players. I think it really brings out the best in jazz players. I think the bottom line for me is that jazz is it's like the perfect intersection between like a brilliant tune, great songs, because I think some of the best songs were written really in the sort of 30s and 40s. That's when all the great songs were in, and improvisation. And I think those two things put together makes up for just like a wonderful form of music, really. So talking about that, I suppose the question probably that people might be thinking is, what actually defines like jazz? I mean, how would you define it, Shaun? What is jazz?
Well, I think you've mentioned improvisation. It's definitely, that developed through the sort of early era of jazz. Kind of syncopated rhythms. It was originally kind of music for dancing too, although it became more sort of through stuff like the Charleston originally, and the Black Bottom Stomp, those sort of dances, and then slightly more sophisticated with more arrangements with stuff like Glenn Miller and Duke Ellington and so on, and then it became slightly more intellectualized, I would say, sort of through the late 40s, 50s and so on, and into small groups. But I think improvisation is probably the key, which you don't sort of get so much in rock. Obviously you let your hair down when you play a guitar solo or something, but yeah.
I think, essentially, I think the way into it for me, it was probably the best way, which was jazz song, because when you understand the songs, the standard songbook, what they call the American songbook, is that you then understand what jazz musicians are doing, which is essentially taking a tune and playing it, and then taking turns to play around with it, and to kind of just sort of use the melody but to embellish it, just like a guitar solo would do, to sort of follow the chords, and then you have a little break each, and then you go back to the tune, and it kind of ends like that. Pretty much you get very used to that way of listening to jazz, actually, the kind of play the tune, play around with the tune, go back to the tune, but the improvisational part is really the exciting bit, which is what can you do with that tune. And I suppose jazz gets to a point, maybe I don't know, 20, 30 years ago, where it kind of gets to breaking point where no one's entirely sure like what actually maybe is jazz, because I think it's maybe lost its original form. It's got so melded into so many other styles now. There is a very interesting quote, though, that you sent me, Shaun, by Bill Evans, the great pianist, sadly lost really long before his time. But what he said was this: in classical music, a mistake is a mistake. But in jazz, a mistake has to be justified by what follows it. And it's like, if you start a sentence, I teach, so this happens quite a lot. when you start a sentence, you don't actually know how you're going to end it. You've got to actually make something of it, I think. And that, in a sense, is what improvised music is. It's, yes, that went awry, that went off in a strange direction, but you've got to justify it, you know, and that's bringing it all back, isn't it, to how it was.
Yeah, I think in my case, when I you know, was forced to play a drum solo, it was fear was the chief motivator.
The driving force, fear, all those stairs. God. So so last thing we want to talk about before we get on to our instrumentals is, how did jazz actually come about? Like, why did jazz happen at all? Because there was a time pre-jazz and then post-jazz, or we're in jazz right now. So the birth of jazz and swing in the mid 1910s-ish really grew out of a sort of potent mixture of three things that were happening in the United States, but sort of coalesced into one style, really. And those three things were ragtime, which is a piano, highly syncopated piano style, with chord structures that would have a huge influence on the early jazz songs that were written. You've got blues musicians playing as well, and that's been around for a while. That sort of grows and grows after jazz starts, but that gives it that kind of gutsy playing style, some of the sort of brassy feel of everything, sort of down to earth, something that really appeals to people, hits them on a gut level, as they say. And then you've got New Orleans brass bands that would form the sort of instrumental basis of jazz. You know, this first sort of iteration anyway, what I suppose we probably call trad jazz now, or something like that. That's where it sort of grew out of and sort of came together. Now, Shaun, did you want to add anything in terms of like where it came from, or are you in agreement?
No, I mean, I can go with that. I mean, I was just gonna mention, you know, in the Deep South, you know, you had these sort of jug bands as well, didn't you? Where you know, they couldn't even afford a cornet, so they had like a sort of a cider flagon or something, you know.
Cider.
And I think some of the scat singing, sort of where they sort of take off the sound of the instrument, particularly the cornet, that sort of thing. So you know, it came out of poverty, I think, really is the other thing, you know. Until they could afford to buy instruments, and no drums really at that point at all. You know, that you had the traps, and which were a sort of improvised, you know, marching bass drums, and obviously you had snare, maybe a cymbal, but little wooden monkey blocks, you know, little wood blocks for percussion, you know, but no real drums. That came sort of really later in the 1920s.
They get a bit more organized later on.
Yeah.
Another thing to point out is that when we're looking at the 1920s, is this sort of the birth really of sort of vinyl phonograph records, you know, and also radio is starting to spread. So the audience for jazz, everything's lined up, isn't it, ready for jazz, basically, which is there is a much bigger audience out there who can hear it via records and via radio. The big sort of figures here really, Louis Armstrong, who's one of the sort of, you know, forefathers of jazz. You've got Jelly Roll Morton, Bix Beiderbecke, Duke Ellington. Anyway, should we get straight on to talking about our instrumentals then? Might need a jingle for that. So, Shaun, I'm going to talk about my first one, then we'll go on to yours. So my instrumental from the 1920s is actually 1927, and it's Bix Beiderbecke, Way Down Yonder in New Orleans. Bix Beiderbecke was a cornet player. He was a saxophone. He was a cornet player and a trombone. And a trumpet player. Let's get that bit right. But the band sort of captured together quite a lot of that brass. You've got a cornet, trombone, as well as trumpet, saxophone, early saxophone, clarinet, also very popular at the time. Banjo, good for percussive sort of rhythm, and also some percussion, as you were saying. You know, not really kits, not really drum kits. I think this song, Way Down Yonder in New Orleans, really captures that whole sort of feel of how jazz was developing at the time. That sort of you know, the use of current popular songs to improvise around. The solos on here are really good, you know, sort of purposeful and exciting. The whole feel is really upbeat. It's got that sort of ragtime influence. You can really feel it on the whole track here. And the title is interesting, of course, because it says way down yonder in New Orleans, like selling jazz as a kind of, geographical thing. Here it is. This is what it's like down there. You should see this place. I think Bix Beiderbecke is considered one of those sort of forefathers of jazz, alongside people like Louis Armstrong. They were both trumpet players. As well, and I think the tune is a really good starting point if you want to get an idea of how jazz sort of, once it had grown into something marketable, was able to be sort of recorded and everything. This is like the kind of thing that really started jazz off. So Shaun, shall we hear your instrumental? What have you got?
Well, wouldn't it be strange if I'd picked Bix Beiderbecke as well?
Wouldn't that be weird?
I have.
Oh my God.
Actually, yeah, that's a great tune, your one. That really is. I picked it, the Jazz Band Ball, which is also 1927, and as you said, he does capture that sort of flavour of the 1920s, that sort of that world of speakeasies, and it's almost Laurel and Hardy-esque, I think, sometimes. Bix Beiderbecke, that sort of incidental music. This is a great tune, as I say. No drums, just percussion. They're all sort of gathered around that sort of recording device, that HMV is Master's Voice, recording funnel. And I find it quite upbeat. I love the way they, in this sort of style of jazz, they'll all sort of stop and highlight an instrument, like a euphonium will take the solo.
Yeah, they stop dead, don't they?
Yeah, they stop dead. I find that highly comical. I actually love it. It's quite endearing. You've got sort of barroom style, like Wild West style piano. It's a terrible recording, but it just communicates the era. And again, this is actually on the original 78. It's Bix Beiderbecke and his gang. So who his gang were, I don't know. Someone will tell me. But he played piano and cornet, but it's cornet he's known for, and he was often described as a very pure player. His sound was supposedly likened to shooting bullets at a bell, so that gives you some idea. He learned to play by ear, and sadly died fairly young at 28. He was in the 28. Is it the 27 club or the 28 club?
27, I think.
Well, he should be an honorary member. He
start a new club,
the 28 club. So he was prone to insomnia, alcoholic, was on a variety of pills and alcohol, which obviously didn't mix. He was found screaming the neighbourhood down on his bed, claiming that two Mexicans were hiding under his bed armed with daggers. So he wasn't actually, but he had some form of pneumonia and sadly passed away. And he became a much more romantic figure in jazz. He was known, but he became sort of bigger than he was. He was a sort of a Syd Barrett-like figure almost. Yes. Films made about him. And I think even Chet Baker and Bill Evans covered songs by him. So
I think he's an interesting contrast to Louis Armstrong, because Louis Armstrong lasted a long time, whereas Bix Beiderbecke was gone. Like by the time jazz sort of really was known nationally, and was sort of growing in popularity, he was already dead by then. It's Louis Armstrong. You see those videos of him in the sort of 60s, don't you? Still playing, still singing. Right. Well, what we're going to do then for each era is have a look at a song as well. And, the difference being, I suppose, that the singer is the leader of the jazz band, and that they are, the purpose of this recording is to hear the song. There may be a solo in there or so, but really it's about the voice on this. So I've got a song here from 1928, and it's called Let's Do It, Let's Fall in Love. And this is Bing Crosby. So an old voice, and I think actually his voice did improve. I think this isn't him necessarily at his best, but it is a great early jazz song. This is with the Dorsey brothers, who crop up. If you sort of listen to early jazz, you'll sort of hear about them quite a lot. And it also has one of my very favourite, early guitarists, Eddie Lang. Wonderful sound. It's unmistakable, his sound on this. When you've heard him once, you just spot him everywhere, really, where he's recorded. So this is a kind of the last sort of 1920s sort of sound of the developing size of the bands. They're getting bigger at this point, you know. This is actually the Jack with Jack Teagarden. It's a very popular song, this. I mean, it still is now, and it still is recorded now, I think. You know, it's lasted a good 100 years, this song. It has this sort of classic middle eight part in it, which we'll talk about a bit with regards to Gershwin, actually, the way in which he wrote as well. This is Cole Porter, who wrote lots of popular songs, you know, and later on, when you get to the sort of 50s, a lot of these singers are starting to record entire albums just of Cole Porter or whoever it is they're recording, you know, these sort of great sets of songs. He was a really big source of inspiration for those early jazz musicians. This song was actually written, I think, for a musical called Paris. I don't know if the musical is well known or not, but I think the song has probably outlived that anyway. The lyrics of this song, if you've heard it, are fairly controversial. I mean, given they're like 100 years old, yeah, you'd think they might have been controversial, but they were more controversial than the ones we know. They were actually had to be edited. It says here, Wikipedia, the obvious go-to, although they do want me to give them some money every time. What they said was Cole Porter's initial lyrics were quite different from the ones that we have now, which is birds do it, bees do it. And that became the popular version. But actually an earlier one which was the original lyrics, had some sort of racial terms in it, like chinks do it, Japs do it. And they actually, Laplanders, and I think that possibly remained that one for some reason, but they were deemed too offensive to go for the song. So it became this kind of birds and bees, which is, you know, as we call the birds and bees, and then insects and things and animals, they all got into there to sort of, you know, be this metaphor for sex, essentially, at the time. But yeah, it's a wonderful song, and it really is a classic jazz standard that I think still to this day is still popular. Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Well, good. Shaun, tell us about your song. What have you got?
Okay. Well, by contrast, I've got Bessie Smith, who is a sort of well-known blues singer. Nobody Loves You When You're Down and Out, which I think is a great title. I identify with that. You know, classic lyrics like nobody knows you when you're down and out. In my pocket, not one penny, and my friends, I haven't any. So she's down on her luck there. Written by pianist Jimmy Cox in a more vaudeville style. And she recorded it much later in 1929. And I think a couple of weeks later, you had the Wall Street crash. So it became very, very popular. Good timing there. So it's a blues. It's got sort of ragtime influences, and it's very much associated with her. I think Nina Simone went on to cover it. Eric Clapton covered it. She was known as the Empress of the Blues, and sadly, only about 45 when she died in a car crash. Quite a colourful character. I'll leave it at that. But you know, I was also going to say, you know, in sort of popular culture, I mean, I've heard her name mentioned or quoted by people as diverse as Robert Plant is a fan. Lennon, apparently John Lennon of Beat Combo, the Beatles. He said that it inspired Cry Baby Cry from the White Album, but
really,
I don't know about that. I don't know. Anyway, but he did write a track called Nobody Loves You, which that's where the similarity ends. But also Ray Davis, he very much like Bessie Smith, and was influenced by her on his song Alcohol. Yes. Oh God, what was it on? Was that on Muswell Hillbillies, or was it?
Yes, I think it is.
Yeah, it was. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And so I mean, he started to use a sort of traditional jazz band really as a backing group with the Kinks. So there were a lot of admirers, which you wouldn't expect, but you know, sadly, another one died too young.
Yeah, and you're right to point out this sort of 60s, you know, link, because, of course, there was a sort of jazz revival in the 60s, wasn't there? Yeah, and that's just not in the jazz world, actually. It percolated right the way through, didn't it, to popular music, and like the Bonzo Dog Band, who I know you really like. Yeah, it's a classic example of a band kind of almost built on the idea of, you know, that sort of 20s jazz sound, isn't it? It's that kind of idea, you know.
Yeah.
Well, swinging along then, we're getting through. We go to the 1930s now. So chopping this up into decades is kind of useful. I suppose a lot of this bleeds through from one decade to another, but, for the purposes of the podcast, is probably the best way to do it. The 1930s is sort of known as like the big band swing era, really. I mean, these bands are getting a lot bigger now. What did start out as small combos of like 5 are now turning into like proper bands with a variety of instruments, playing swing. Now, swing is a very specific, rhythm which does really last actually in jazz, and it's this sort of offbeat. 1 2 3 4 1 2, so you get the emphasis on the 2 and the 4, and I although I'm not very good at describing that, for anyone listening, if you want to know what swing rhythm is, it's the rocking around the Christmas tree. It's probably the best example of that. It's just got a very strong swing feel to it. We also see in the 30s the birth of what we call gypsy jazz. That's probably not the PC way to say it now, but that's in Belgium and France. We get this sort of growing blend of American jazz along with sort of French dance hall styles as well. There's an explosion of figures now because jazz is really growing in popularity. You've got people like Benny Goodman and Count Basie, Django Reinhardt, guitarist, Coleman Hawkins actually is one of the sort of forerunners of Charlie Parker. He's like a kind of sort of warning of what's going to happen to jazz later. Glenn Miller, of course, in the big bands, and you've got Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong are still going pretty strong there. So let's have a look. We've got for my instrumental, I've got Django Reinhardt, who is a Belgian, I think he's Belgian, guitarist, who recorded, who played violin, played guitar, but he recorded a song which originally, the title, Limehouse Blues, is actually about a place in London. Originally, a sort of British Chinatown was in a place called Limehouse. If you look it up on Google Maps, you can see this little area called Limehouse. It's still there, and it was where the Chinese sort of community was. That's all shifted since over to sort of Soho, is like Chinatown now, but it's in East London. And this is recorded with someone called Stefan Grappelli, who is a violinist. He's got quite a sad sort of background, actually, a sort of bit of an orphan who had to sort of scrape his way through, but he finally met Django Reinhardt and started playing jazz. He worked in cinemas, sort of making music up to 6 hours a day. I guess playing along with the pianist they'd have at the time with the sort of silent movies and things. It's a really exciting track, this Limehouse Blues. I mean, it's hard to beat it just for pure energy. Sometimes you hear it, you think it's the pace is so hectic in this, but the rhythm is so, this is without any percussion. The guitars keep the rhythm so perfectly. And there's this big dynamic playoff between Django Reinhardt, the guitarist, and Stefan Grappelli. But there is one thing about Django Reinhardt we need to know, which is he only had 2 fingers that could really function for full fingers. Django Reinhardt had a horrible accident in his younger days when he was rescuing his violin, I think it was at the time, or guitar possibly, from a fire in a caravan he was living in, and as a result of that he lost 2 fingers basically, and they were just stubs that were left. So to hear Django Reinhardt play, you would never believe that this guy has got 2 fingers, but he plays it so well, and I think he found ways around it that really helped him to be able to just continue like nothing had happened. Must have taken some time, but a phenomenal guitarist. And if you are a guitarist or you like to hear kind of clever trickery, then he's a fantastic person to listen to. The last thing I'll say on it is that they played a lot in Montmartre in Paris, which is just like such a lovely place, isn't it? I mean, the idea of that, imagine that in the 1930s. Wow, the romance, Shaun, I can't get over it.
La Belle Epoque.
There you go. All your
great.
Stuff.
That's great. I'm going all warm and fuzzy thinking about it, and influenced not necessarily in a playing style, but Tony Iommi of Black Sabbath, his manager, after his accident, you probably all know this story. He worked at a steel mill and chopped his fingers off basically, and he thought, oh no, I'm buggered now, I can't play. He chopped my fingers off. And his manager said, here, listen, go and listen to this. You know, this bloke, he's got a withered hand, you know, and you can go and you can play if you practice, you know. So sorry, terrible. But there you are. He never looked back, did he?
He didn't. It's a similar story. It is.
Yeah, it is really developed a unique style. But the other thing was I was going to say was because there were no sort of amplifiers. You know, the guitar were part of the sort of rhythm section, really, wasn't it? And it was only, you know, till sort of Django and people like Charlie Christian that came along and sort of radicalized it, you know.
They really had to, you had to play in a certain way to get the volume across. That is true. This is pre-amplified music, of course. So Shaun, what's your instrumental from the 30s?
Right, I'll try and be brief about this. It's Sing Sing Sing, specifically by the Benny Goodman Orchestra. It's 1937, and the reason is it's the first song in jazz where the drummer is projected into the spotlight. And this song has influenced countless drummers. It's Gene Krupa on the drums, of course, and he's inspired countless drummers from Buddy Rich, who sort of, you know, he was the messiah to Gene Krupa's John the Baptist, really. Moving on into the world of rock, you know, people like Keith Moon, the whole caboodle, you know, Bill Ward, Black Sabbath, John Bonham, Ian Pace, Carl Palmer, they all love and pay homage to Gene Krupa. And he's just such a great rhythmic player and a showman, and he really makes this song his own. And it begins with a sort of an infectious sort of tribal tom rhythm, then you get the horns come in, it's arranged brilliantly. It's an anthem. It makes you want to get up and jive about even if you can't, you know. So it's wonderful. You've got Benny Goodman on the top of that, you know, with his sort of lilting clarinet where he sort of floats along on the top. Composed originally by Louis Prima, but you know, Benny Goodman is known for this. You know, he took it and ran with it, and it's a 9-minute epic. You know, they had to squeeze it onto two sides of a 78, for heaven's sake. You know, so you know we're into almost prog rock territory with this. I think you'll all know it. It's been in countless films. You know, Benny Goodman, the king of swing. You know, he was quite avuncular, I'd say, in a sort of Bill Haley sort of way. You know, he wasn't a sort of a sex symbol or anything, you know, and very popular from the 30s right through to the late 40s, really. So it's great. It's a classic.
Yeah, I think Gene Krupa and Buddy Rich, who's normally put together with him, they're slightly different generations, I think, aren't they? But they're both slightly unusual looking people, actually, aren't they? I don't know if it's the drums that do it. It's worth pointing out, sorry, listeners, that I have actually put together a playlist of all of these songs that we mentioned. So if you want to sort of dig into what we're talking about and, you know, tell us if you agree or disagree, you know, give us your ideas, then obviously you can search that out. That will be in the description for the podcast. Worth saying in the middle of a podcast. Anyway, so moving on to songs, I've got for my 1930s songs, I've got Billie Holiday and a song called What a Little Moonlight Can Do. This is with a group called the Teddy Wilson Orchestra. There's not too much to say about this, except that this is recorded right at the start of her career, you see. I mean, it's, you know, 1935 is sort of fairly early for her anyway. It was written for a film called The Roadhouse. What it does, this song, is it captures her as a sort of in an exciting moment of you know, sort of romance, which buries what is often the only thing people know about her, which is this overbearing melancholy. I think that's what she's known for. That's, you know, that's the sound you're used to with Billie Holiday. But actually, this is really bright and breezy. It's unusual to hear her singing like this. It's a lovely song, but it captures the sophistication of her voice without getting into some of the things she does that I really don't appreciate as much, which is kind of the habit she gets into of singing in certain ways. Notes falling at the end of bars, lacking the sort of strength in her voice. I think that those things don't really appear on here. This is like an upbeat song. It's fun. It's very much of the time, you know. And I appreciate her voice. I just think that there's, you know, this lighter side. I sort of think I prefer for her, which is probably a very unusual opinion to have of Billie Holiday. But there you go. Shaun, your song.
Yeah, good. My song. I've gone for Cab Calloway, Minnie the
Oh,
Moocher,
yes.
which some of you might know from the Blues Brothers film, where he's sort of stalling for time at the end, and he goes on and does this version. So it's a great sort of slow blues introduction which sets the scene. Cab Calloway's got a very theatrical style and performance, and he crossed over, I'd say, from black music to white audiences. This was a smash when it came out, the biggest chart topper of 1931. Sold 1 million. Famous for his sort of scat style singing, and it's got sort of audience participation played live, which you can sort of see in the Blues Brothers film. But it was quite a sad song, actually. You wouldn't get that from the sort of performance and delivery. It came from a vaudeville hit called Willie the Weeper, originally in the 1900s. So this song had been around, and it was about a hoochie coochie dancer. Shocking, I know. It's laden with drug references, describing Minnie's dreams, and he's got some empathy for her. He sort of sings, she messed around with a bloke named Smokey. She loved him even though he was cokey. So
yeah, he was
together. Yeah. And he sings at the end, "Oh, my poor Min, my poor Min," positively making you weep there at the end. But it's a great performance. I mean, I loved this when I was a kid. I didn't know anything about jazz. It probably came on what was it, Children's Favourites or Ed Stewart. Do you remember Ed Stewart on Radio 2, or is that going too far back for you? He used to have
but he was on forever, wasn't he? I mean, does he even have an era?
Yeah, not really, no. So yeah, there you go.
Great. Well, that sounds good. I think Minnie the Moocher is very popular because of that call and response thing, isn't it? I mean, you get a lot of that with sort of. I always think of it as one of those sort of holiday songs. Like it's a song you hear people, drunk Brits, singing abroad, isn't it? It's that kind of thing. It's a lovely little tune, that as well. I totally agree. Well, look, we're coming up to the 1940s now, and this is essentially the 30s are often referred to as sort of early 30s, I suppose, are really known as the sort of golden age of swing, and probably the before we get to the sort of 50s, the era that people would really remember. That way, if jazz had collapsed in the war and never come back, that would be the sort of thing everyone would remember, I think. But there is, as with everything, with World War II, there is a sort of pre-war and post-war situation with jazz, which is you've got, the bands as they are touring and appearing and recording, then World War II turns up, and then you've got the musicians afterwards. And it pretty much splits, in that you've got before the war or during the war, jazz was pretty much used as a kind of morale booster. A lot of these bands went off. They were entertaining if they were still functioning as bands. They were going off to sort of play to people around the world, wherever they were. Big bands, could no longer afford to tour, a lot of them, or their members had already been, taken off and they'd gone off to war. Some obviously were recording, doing radio broadcasts, but it was very much like used to sort of, during the war for that kind of thing. And when the players came back, of course, and some, who didn't leave, basically they'd had enough, I think. And the war kind of set this, it's happened in Britain as well, with this notion that we need a better deal, basically. Black musicians, it was essentially pretty much the only jazz musicians. They had played for white audiences mainly before the war, and they'd sort of had that. And then after the war, everything starts to change then, which is they've decided they're going to do their own thing. And Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie are kind of the forerunners of that. In Harlem and some other places, specific clubs where people were just playing for their own audiences, doing their own thing. you know, taking songs or writing them themselves, you know, and doing their own thing with it. So that's what my starting point really is. 1945 this is, and this is Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie with Dizzy Atmosphere. Very, very hard to say the phrase Dizzy Atmosphere without thinking of the Russ Abbott hit from 1984, Happy Atmosphere. I love a party with a dizzy atmosphere. It's not that, though. It's not based on that. Harmonically, this song is sort of based on a progression that from 1930, I Got Rhythm. There are some fundamental tracks in jazz, and this is one of them. George Gershwin wrote I Got Rhythm then, and it has this 32-bar sequence, 8 bars repeated with another 8 bars, which then go into the third 8, which is a sort of variation on the first 2, and then it goes back and resolves in the last 8 bars. And that's used a lot in writing songs and the structure of jazz improvisations. I would get the guitar out, but I'm afraid I'm so out of practice at the moment that it probably would sound like some sort of weird jazz I'm making up myself. Anyway, so it was mimicked a lot there, and I think this dizzy atmosphere is like a foundation of what we call bebop. Bebop is what came out, and bebop is the sound of sort of improvised, a horn sound, really, isn't it? And I think that's where it comes from. Is that right, Shaun? The sort of bebop, bebop,
yeah,
that kind of thing. And I think
that's right.
This is a great bebop, you know, composition here. The solos go between Dizzy Gillespie, who is a trumpet player, to Charlie Parker, who plays saxophone. Dizzy Gillespie had a sort of altered or some sort of unusual trumpet, didn't he? I remember you telling me once, Shaun. I can't remember exactly what it was, but he is well known for those cheeks.
Hamster cheeks.
Hamster cheeks. Used to store, you know, sort of other musical instruments in there. I think this is, I mean, for an early bebop, and it does sound old, you know, it does sound old now because we're used to hearing, you know, the sort of Miles Davis stuff. It sounds a bit clearer, better produced. This is, you know, old sounding, but it's a really good example of that highly sort of sophisticated, syncopated playing. The solos are really exceptional on here. I don't know how. I mean, the speed they play out of some of this, I don't know how they even keep time. The unison playing on this is like something to behold. I mean, they play exactly the same, really complex lines, but they are so in sync. It makes you wonder when you first hear it, if you're hearing one instrument, actually. It's so well done. So I think it's a great example. If you want to hear anything sort of early bebop, then I think this is probably it. Shaun, what have you got for us?
Good. Well, I've gone, poles apart really, but I've gone for Lionel Hampton from 1942. This is a track called Flying Home. We're in the sort of big band era, and you know, he was known as a percussionist, a drummer, and a vibraphone player. He was probably my dad's favorite jazz musician, and the vibraphone is a strange instrument. You know, it's not really lasted in the world of jazz. I mean, it's so bloody heavy to sort of transport, isn't it? Yeah,
just like gigging with a piano, isn't it, or something? Terrible.
But this particular song, I mean, obviously quite sort of romantic, as you say. It's a sort of keep your chin up sort of tune, you know. It's nostalgic, and but it's also got a sort of 4 to the floor bass and drum rhythm and sax part, and it's kind of, I would say, has a feel of there's echoes of sort of bop and sort of early sort of Bill Haley-esque rock and roll in here. And this is from 42, so you know, if you really listen, you can hear the music changing slightly. Originally written in 1939, but this is, you know, again, jazz musicians take a tune and run with it, and he did, and he's known for this, you know. Apparently came up with the you know, he recorded it earlier, but he developed this with his own group. I think Benny Goodman had a hand in it, but Lionel Hampton ran with this tune essentially. But it's often been described as rollicking, this particular tune. And another thing but as well as the sort of the sort of the early sort of R&B sort of influence, and R&B in the old sense of the word.
Yes.
Not, I don't know. I can't think of. I don't know. I don't know what the kids are listening to, so I couldn't tell you. So
Yeah.
But he mentored people like Charles Mingus, Wes Montgomery, Quincy Jones as well,
Ooh,
and
yeah.
Dinah Washington. So he's a bit like in Britain, we had Chris Barber, who sort of brought people on and introduced musicians to a new audience. So yeah, he was a good guy, Lionel Hampton.
Yeah, a bit like Alexis Corner, I suppose, in the sort of blues
Yeah,
world.
yeah,
Yeah, there's
yeah,
a sort of
exactly, yeah.
father, isn't there, of this? It's interesting, it's sort of these liminal spaces between styles, because sometimes you get a glimmer of the future, don't you, in a style that's being played. I always find, I mean, this is off obviously what we're talking about here, but I'm a really big fan of Hank Williams. And when you hear some of his stuff, I think there's very little between someone like him and Elvis, actually. I mean, Hank Williams died in 1949, but it's like if you just remove Hank Williams and put someone in who can shake their hips and get rid of the violin, it's kind of like that is rock and roll. You know, there's very little between it. You're just waiting, and it's wonderful in retrospect to see that. Obviously, they don't know it at the time, but we know what's about to happen. You know, and you can just see it moving towards it. It's great. Yeah, well, Shaun, we'll move on to the last part then, which is our songs. Yeah, our songs. So I've got something that I'm sure lots of people will recognize. The style is very wartime, this, which is the Andrew Sisters, American trio, singing Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy. You have to say it slow, it doesn't work otherwise, does it? And this is from 1944. I mean, for all the work that, you know, these sort of some of these early singers did, they pretty much squashed a lot of that because they're a trio and they flattened out the kind of jazz style. But my God, the beauty of their singing together is just fantastic. I think that they kind of, this is like pop jazz, maybe. I mean, you know, sometimes you wonder whether you're listening to jazz or not. I mean, I think this is a kind of example of that. Very, you know, sort of, you know, morale boosting kind of stuff. It lacks that improvisation, but when they break into solo parts, you get little flashes of that maybe, but they sound great when they're all singing together. They were hugely appealing, the Andrew Sisters. I don't know if we had anything similar in this country, or were they really successful here, Shaun? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think they were just successful in Europe. Yeah.
Yeah. So really hugely appealing, the sort of sweetness of their tone, very memorable, you know, and it's kind of the sort of Formby effect, George Formby effect, which is they're great sing-alongs, these songs, you know, they're memorable, poppy, easy to sing. They're short, you know, they're a couple of minutes long. Also, it's very well chosen, this tune, because I think that, you know, the lyrics, because it's actually about a jazz musician who goes away to war, who plays this style, this boogie woogie style, which I haven't actually mentioned, but and no one can understand him in Company B, which is the group he's in. But they, you know, the sergeant major kind of, or whatever they're called there, doesn't understand it, but he sorts it out, and they get the band together, and everything's fine, you know. So it's kind of really uplifting, even from a jazz perspective. It's kind of got that edge as well. I think there is a legacy to this style, though. I mean, with the Andrew Sisters, it doesn't stop there. Although you think, when you hear that classic wartime trio thing, you think, oh, that's very wartime. But of course, it had a huge effect alongside groups like the Ink Spots and the Mills Brothers, who had a big impact on people like Brian Wilson, of course. But a lot of those kids growing up, you know, the post-war kids, you know, so the Lennon and McCartneys, you know, all those sort of British, you know, war babies would have heard a lot of this. And you really hear it, I think, in the Hollies, actually. Who do genuinely do 3-part harmonies, you know, that's kind of what that's what set them aside in the 60s, I think. And that really all comes down from that kind of sound, I think. You know, they would have really appreciated that and would have heard it as youngsters as well. So that's my song for the 40s.
Good. Yeah. Okay.
Sure, what have you got?
Right. Well, my last one is a bit of a cheeky one. This, it's not really a vocal, but it's Salt Peanuts by Dizzy Gillespie, which excellent. I was shocked to find out was recorded in 1941, and you know, it's a sort of frenetic, sort of almost bebop style, very infectious. It's a tune that I goes way back, you know. I seem to have heard this in popular culture, and written by Dizzy Gillespie and drummer Kenny Clark. And after they were fired from Ella Fitzgerald's orchestra for some sort of shenanigans.
Yeah, there's a lot of shenanigans in jazz.
But is it a vocal? Well, he just repeats salt peanuts. And the thing is, it sort of strobes, and it actually sounds like soapy nuts, which is I picked it 'cause it's quite humorous.
Once you've heard it, you can't unhear it.
You can't unhear it, and it's got a great little snare solo with the brushes, with the snare turned off, so you get that sort of bongo tom sort of sound.
I love that.
It's really great. Very early sort of bop, and something I thought would have been recorded after the war. I was quite taken aback actually, but there you go. So it was in the ether quite early on.
Well, Shaun, that's fantastic. I mean, we have rollicked our way through, if that's even a word, from the 20s right through to the 40s. But listeners, what we're trying to do is give you a sort of insight into the sort of basics of this, what sort of styles were appearing in different eras. Hopefully you've learned something from it. Thank you so much for listening. Obviously, as usual, and Tim would normally say this, but he ain't here, which is please like and subscribe. And if you're watching on YouTube, of course, it is also on Spotify. So you can go and check that out. There will be a link in both to our playlist, which is also on Spotify, so you can have a listen to these songs. Shaun, thank you so much for your insights. It's been a fascinating discussion. Have you anything else you'd like to add? Anything we missed?
I have nothing further to say.
It's like you in court. I have nothing to add, Your Honour. Okay, well, with that, then we'll say goodbye, and we'll see you in part 2, where we're going to get ourselves right the way through to the 70s. This is getting frightening. Okay,
Cheers.
bye.
Bye.